no. What? We're good? Okay. Cool. Everyone, I would say welcome, but we've been standing here for 15 minutes. Yeah, so this is, you're going to hear a 45-minute spiel about space-based solar power and why it's the greatest thing ever, even though, you know, it's maybe not. We'll see. If this will work, that'd be nice. Yeah. Okay, so what the hell am I talking about here? So a little bit of background. In 1964, so that's like 80 years ago now, Kardashev came up with this scale to determine kind of how advanced a civilization is. So it starts at type 0, which are the plebs. They are the ones that have not even managed to get all of the energy on their home planet yet. Type 1 moves up to properly, you know, you're a proper civilization. You're capturing all of the energy on your planet. Type 2, you are able to capture the whole energy on the scale of a star. Now, the way he phrased it was their home star, but that would probably kill them. So it's really on the scale of a star. And then type 3 and beyond is you're kind of sucking the energy out of galaxies at that point. You're doing like black hole energy, black hole engines, stuff like that. Very sci-fi things, but it's what he had come up with. So yeah, we're type 0, which kind of sucks. So, well, we can change that pretty simply. We just need to take all of the sun's energy that hits Earth, which you might think we're starting to do with how much solar power we're using, but we are not even fractions of decimals of percent of the way there. So how do you go about this? Well, one way is a Dyson sphere. So a Dyson sphere, very simply, is an encapsulation of a star that is meant to collect and harness and then somehow output the entire output of the star. So you kind of put the sun, in our case, in a ball, and you are collecting all of the energy that comes out of it, and that is using to power our civilization. So you kind of would have a pipe coming out of that, whether that's, you know, a big laser beam or a bunch of wires, and then you end up getting all of the power out of the star. But there are a few issues with that. Mainly, the closest other star to us is Proxima Centauri, which is something like 4 light years away. So we would probably have to go to the sun. And if you put the sun in a ball, you don't get sunlight anymore. So no sunlight probably definitely 100% kills us all, and also kills anything else in the solar system and makes everything uninhabitable. So you have a lot of power, but you also are dead. So that's kind of an issue. So instead, you might just say, well, we'll just poke a lot of holes in the sphere so we still get sunlight. I feel like that's probably a good idea. So a Dyson swarm, very similar concept. It's a high-density satellite array or satellite infrastructure that kind of swarms or somewhat encapsulates a star and is meant to kind of take in or ingest a lot of the power that the sun outputs, obviously, or that the star outputs. Not exactly the same as a sphere. You're not encapsulating it, but you're kind of, what it sounds like, you're swarming around it and you're trying to take in as much energy as possible. So in the spirit of good faith, this is one way something like a Dyson swarm could function for Earth. This is actually what my high school research senior project was about. So tells you how good of an idea this is. So in the middle, you have our sun, and you could throw up a bunch of satellites around that. Assuming that you're able to get satellites that are on the scale of 5 to 10 kilometers square, so that's bigger than like New York City. Assuming you can get that there, you could be reasonably harvesting terawatts of energy within having, 50 to 1,000 satellites, something within that range. But how do you get that energy back to Earth? Well, you could send a gigantic laser beam that was something like 50 terawatts directly towards the Earth, which I admit it sounds like a great idea. But if you miss your receiver, that's like kind of a few nuclear ton bombs. So instead, what you can do is place these kind of specialized receiving units at very special points around nearby Earth's orbit called Lagrange points. Some of you might have heard of Lagrange points because you're nerds, or because of the James Webb Space Telescope is over in L2. It's orbiting in L2. The kind of special thing about these points is they're kind of pseudo-planet-like in the sense that you can orbit around them or be stationary nearby them. And all of the gravity from the surrounding celestial objects kind of cancels out. So you can kind of just float there without actually orbiting or decaying into another planet or something like that. So you could have these giant collection facilities that are OK to send very large laser beams to without potentially killing everyone, and then kind of trickle charge back to Earth as Earth orbits around its orbit. There's still quite a few issues with this, though. The main one being that kind of no matter how you spin it, you're either getting very, very little power to Earth and spending quadrillions of dollars to get gigawatts on the ground after decades of building infrastructure, or you're still sending gigawatt-class lasers directly to the Earth over extended periods of time and just hoping everything works out. So as a whole, it's quite a tricky situation. I don't think Kardashev really thought about this when he made his whole class system. I don't think Dyson really thought about it when he kind of put together his ideas. They were all kind of pie-in-the-sky concepts at the time. Yeah, but they suck. Thanks for coming and talk. No, I'm joking. So what if we throw away the sun and we say we're just going to put a lot of satellites around Earth because, maybe you won't get as much power, but this could still get us to type 1, right? You can collect most, if not all, of the solar power that's hitting Earth. And it's a lot easier to go from an orbit that's 250, 300 kilometers up to the ground than it is to go from the sun back to the Earth or from Jupiter or wherever the orbit is. So I welcome you to space-based solar power. This is a very wide-ranging topic. It can mean a lot of different things. But in our case, space-based solar power is the general concept of utilizing satellite infrastructure to capture solar energy and somehow transmit it back down to the Earth, with the goal of capturing most of the power that gets sent to the Earth. So to walk you through the history of this, because people have been talking about this shit for like a long time. Nothing's really happened because it's hard, but it's kind of been on people's minds for a while. So all the way back in 1941, space solar power was introduced by, what's this guy's name? I don't even remember. Yeah, Asimov, in one of his books, stories. Like everything else that I already talked about, it was just a theory. It was not a real idea. But it sparked a lot of big nerds that read Asimov to start thinking about what it would actually look like to do what he proposed. So over in 1964, kind of tangential to space solar power, you have wireless power transfer kind of starting to develop. And this is all the technology that enables, well, exactly what it sounds like. You have some power source, you have some target, and you're able to transmit energy between them wirelessly. To some extent, it's the same thing if you put your phone on a wireless charger, but it's also the same thing as if you shine a laser and pop a balloon. They're all wireless power transfer using electromagnetic radiation, using light, It's all the same thing, just in different forms. 1964 was kind of a cornerstone experiment, big milestone of powering a kind of helicopter-like aircraft with RF power from the ground. So this guy back, right after World War II was like, oh, I'm going to power this aircraft. I'm going to stick a giant receiver, and we'll get into what that actually means later, on a plane. And I'm going to shoot RF up into the air, and I'm going to make it fly. So that kind of started this parallel trend of all of this wireless power tech at the same time that all of this space-based solar power craze was kind of coming into line. In 1968, interestingly, Glaser had a patent for space-based solar power. So he actually patented the idea of, I'm going to send up a satellite that's going to beam RF from space and collect it on the ground. So there was a period of time where that was patented for a number of reasons that doesn't really matter. But it's interesting someone did it. Which brings us to kind of the 70s boom, where for about a decade, most major governments and space agencies around the world, except for India, at the time at least, were pumping money into making concepts on what space solar power could look like. And there were all the images you see on Google came from around this era. Department of Energy and European Space Agency were kind of the big players. A lot of conceptual ideas about putting up these giant arrays of mirrors and crazy concentrators and solar laser beams and all this crazy stuff that is still not a thing, but was an idea for a while. But the most important thing to come out of the 70s, period, regardless of what you're talking about, is NASA's experiment for 34 kilowatt power beaming. So this is still probably the experiment that a lot of people point to as the most, the peak of wireless power. It was 34 kilowatts at 1.5 kilometers. They had this ginormous receiver array and ginormous transmit antenna, and they sent all this power, and it's still pretty much the highest power at the highest efficiency at the longest distance, or one of those experiments that has been done, and it's been half a century, which is kind of sad. 1980, a little bit of a cool-off period, but little pet interest of mine on top of all of this. Canada had its SHARP program, which kind of was ridiculous, but it looked really cool. It was, if you've seen the E-2 Hawkeye, which is a plane that we use now that has this giant radome, it is a plane and then it just has a giant circle on top of it. It kind of looked exactly like that, but it was on the bottom and it was a receiver for power. So they actually built this plane that flew at high altitudes and received power wirelessly and had somewhat persistent flight, and it was actually a successful program. And the reason, at least the public reason, for it getting shut down was the prototype was made out of mostly wood, and they left it in a hangar, and rats ate it. So it was by far the leading technology, and it might have gotten killed from rats. And I don't think Canada's entered the wireless power game since. So yeah, Canada might have been stopped by a pack of rats. I don't know. In the 90s, things started to pick up again. I don't have a great reason for why the 90s, but it was the 90s, so I'm sure this somehow fit in everything else going on at the time. NASA relaunched their space-based solar power efforts. They were the ones that did the really cool experiment in the 70s. So they were like, hey, we're going to come up with cool ideas for what these experiments could look like going forward. They had their CERT program, and China and Japan started to enter the race, which started the JAXA effort or JAXA is the Japanese Space Agency, I guess sidebar. They're one of the big players now, so they started in the 90s. So if you keep that in the back of your head, later they'll come in to the story, and they have some really cool technology going out now. Fast forward many years, because nothing really happened at all for wireless power or space power for about 15 to 20 years until the mid-2010s. And skipping a few things here and there and a few startups that failed and all that stuff, 2023, the Naval Research Lab launched their PRAM program, which was a sandwich tile that they flew in space. It was literally like a 1 meter square tile that just had solar panels on one side and an RF emitting tile on the other side. And they just showed that they were able to convert solar to RF while in space. And they like beamed it to themselves like in this little box thing. And also, shout out the Spider mission, which we'll talk about later, which is a Air Force research lab and I believe Space Force mission that is led by Northrop Grumman, began their work on the Arachne demonstrator, which was the second demonstrator in their kind of Spider program. That started in 2022-2023 timeline, and it's launching, supposed to be last year. Now it's like 2 years from now, I don't know. And now moving all the way to right now, JAXA is now launching their first big demonstrator. So it's part of their, okay, I'm gonna try it. I think it's Ohisama program, but it's going to be an actual demonstration of converting solar power to RF and beaming it to the Earth and receiving it on the ground, which will be the first time that's been done. Again, even though it's been 120 years, or 100 years almost, since someone said we should do this, first time we are going to probably be receiving power from space. So after all of those decades of kind of not a lot actually getting progressed, these are some of the major players right now. There are a lot more than this, but in my opinion, these are the ones that maybe have potential to do interesting things. I'll go in no particular order. Office of Naval Research, Naval Research Lab, they just fund a lot of stuff. And they honestly have some of the smartest people in the military there, outside of maybe DARPA, which takes a lot of their people, so makes sense. And they're funding a lot of this power transfer tech. Air Force Research Lab, Naval Research Lab, both big players in the space. The Spider program, that is the government program for space solar power. There are other directed energy programs, there's other wireless power programs, but if you're talking space solar power, this is the program that the government is funding. It's the US government, so if that's gonna get a lot of dollars, that's gonna see a lot of progress. You have Virtus Solis, which frankly, no one really knows what they do. They've just been around for a long time. I don't think they've done anything. They've just raised a lot of money and kind of said they're building tech for the last 15 years. And I won't talk about Pulse right now, but Aetherflux is a special shout out because they were just founded by the ex-CEO of Robinhood, the brokerage platform. And right away, they might be the most funded of all of these outside of Spider. I think they're going to raise something like $50 or $60 million right out the gate. So they, they'll have the money. I just not super confident in their idea, which we'll get to a little bit later. So this is from the European Space Agency. It's kind of a helpful map of how far we actually are from being able to do anything. So this is that 34 kilowatts at 1.5 kilometers that I mentioned. It's kind of a drop in the bucket compared to what we'll have to do eventually. So if you have the holy grail for space solar power is a gigawatt satellite, so one satellite that's able to transmit 1 gigawatt. If you do the quick math, that's that's like 150 times or something like that, like less than what NASA has, or more than that. I don't even know. I didn't do public math. So we're pretty far away. We've never transmitted more than a roughly 40 kilowatts. And 1.5 kilometers barely gets you above like some of the tallest buildings in the world. So coming from space, we're going to have to go an order of magnitude farther. And we've never demonstrated anything like that. So we're pretty far away from being able to do anything meaningful. And there are other kind of core issues to this whole structure, which I think we're coming to next, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, no, okay. So these are the things I had mentioned. NRL sandwich tile. This is pretty much one of the only things that's actually flown in space after all this time. There was more than this, but it was really close to just launching this up in a satellite. Like, there wasn't much more that went into the program. It was really cool, but at the end of the day, it was a 1 meter PV cell that converts to RF power. They're working on it, but it's not very impressive. To walk through it, if anyone's interested, it's exactly what it looks like. This is a solar cell here. You have a bunch of magic in the middle that converts to DC and then RF, or yeah, DC and then RF. And then there's just an antenna array on the back, just a phased array, that will transmit the power, allegedly. And yet nothing has been powered so far. The Spider mission, bit more detail, bit more background on it. Space, solar power, incremental demonstration and review. Spider, very creative, probably the best part of the mission. It's led by Northrop Grumman, mainly funded by Air Force or Air Force Research Lab. Their goal is to show a fully deployable scale space solar satellite. So I believe the objective is 1 kilometer square, which is humongous. That's 1,000 times bigger than Pram. I don't think they'll get there, but it's a deployable structure and would show the deploying, the collection of energy, and the transmission down to Earth to some receiver. Right now, they started with the spiral demonstration, which there wasn't much news on. It was like a very basic satellite demonstration. Arachne is what this is. It's cool. They make a really big deal out of it. It really doesn't do much. The real cool one is Spindle, which will be the first deployable one, where you'll actually have like a deployable array that will go up and do the same mechanism that is planned for the kind of full-scale model. And then you come to the private side, and this is really the Wild West, because no one really knows what the hell they're doing over here. Like I said, Virtus Solis, these guys have been around for like 15 years, and they raise a lot of money. They haven't really done much. Aether Flux, yeah, so there's kind of 3 buckets, and these are kind of the three examples of those 3 buckets. So Virtus Solis, very much like Spider, it's RF power. You're sending up giant satellites, and you're beaming down via RF to the Earth. Then you have places like Aether Flux, which is doing laser power. So again, you have somewhat large solar cells on satellites, and you are sending that down to Earth with a big laser, which to me sounds stupid, and I've yet to be convinced that you shouldn't do that. But they're raising a lot of money, so maybe I'm just stupid. I don't know. And then you have in-space wireless power, and that's places like Pulse that are, again, collecting a lot of solar energy and beaming it between satellites. The play there is that it's not that far between satellites when you're comparing going down to Earth. It's safer, and there's potentially a lot more cost savings to being able to extend the life of satellites if you can beam power to them versus all of the benefits that you potentially get from beaming power down to Earth. This is a fun quote from a professor that we just talked to a few weeks ago, actually. He said, "Space solar power is a walking idiot test." And what he meant by that is it's pretty stupid no matter how you cut it. So I've talked a lot about people spending lots of money to try to do this, and that's because having energy where you want it, having GPS for energy, if you will, is very appealing. And solving the Earth's energy demand is very appealing. But just like there's a reason we haven't just covered half of Wyoming in solar panels, like Elon said or whatever, there's a reason we haven't done this. And at a very high level, it's because of basic algebra. If you have an RF emitter or an RF antenna, and you're sending down power from space, the area of that transmission expands as you go towards the ground. So even if you're at the closest possible orbit and are just flinging around at like 80 kilometers a second, like right in the low atmosphere, your spot size on the ground is still either going to be so large that it doesn't make any sense, or your power is going to be such low power density that you'd be better off actually just using a regular solar panel on the ground. And if you're just going to send lasers from the ground, from the sky instead, then if you want a power density that is in the safe zone but still higher than like sunlight on the ground, your spot size is still going to be large enough that it's a very tricky situation to be in. Yes, Carter? Yeah. So the issue with that is, and that's what Aetherflux is doing. So Aetherflux is targeting something like a 8 to 50, I know that's a big range, but something like that, kilowatt laser. The issues with that are on the satellite side. If you're going to have small sats and just like a huge swarm of them, then you need a small satellite, and lasers are like very large, and the optics that you need for the lasers are very heavy. So that's what Aetherflux is trying to do, and they just started like 6 months ago or something like that. But they're trying to say, hey, we're going to have a special optics system that does all the crazy adaptive optics that normally is like kilograms and kilograms and kilograms of like glass in this little package, and we're going to have like a fiber laser, and then we're just going to have a bunch of them that would kind of like come together. There are other issues with that, though, that still happen with heat. They happen with the atmosphere. They happen with the fact that it's just really hard to coordinate things like that with how many other things are going on in the atmosphere and the world at any one time. If you're not over the terrestrial United States, it's a lot easier. But in the US, if you're trying to do anything in the sky that's regarding electromagnetic radiation, you have to go past a lot of people, and it takes a long time. So doing that on demand when you need it is like next to impossible right now. It's kind of like supersonic aircraft, just not something that's there right now. I just thought this was a funny quote. I don't think it's necessarily true, but it's directionally correct that most ways we've gone about space solar power at this point are fundamentally broken, the Spider program included, which is probably why it's frozen at the moment. So I guess if you kind of give up on the whole Dyson swarm idea and just say, well, we're just beaming power places, and we just want power on demand, then you eventually kind of back into terrestrial power beaming. So power beaming on the ground, to the ground, or within the atmosphere, I'll say. So here's a few of the key players. I'll shill for Red Helm really quick. Red Helm's the company I work for. We do wireless power transfer or power beaming to drones. Very similar to Power Light, which is that middle logo right there that looks stupid. They also do that. They have terrestrial applications for like industrial use and some other things. But generally, their core concept is they shine a laser at some receiver at some distance, and they have a receiver there that they've built, and they're able to transmit power in that way. DARPA is the core funder of a lot of these right now. Their power program is really what's pushing that part of the industry forward, along with Air Force again and Navy again. And while slightly less popular than laser power when you're talking terrestrial, Reach is a really cool company that is working with RF from the ground. So they've built very, very advanced RF antenna phased array ground stations that can transmit pretty high power at pretty high densities pretty far in very interesting ways. And happy to answer questions about their tech. It's really cool, but it's not the core focus here. So just a shout out to them. They're a cool company. So yeah, like if you're trying to transmit power, this is what DARPA says it should look like. So this is actually taken from a DARPA slideshow of what they say wireless power on the battlefield could look like. This connection right here specifically is what they call the power program. I don't remember what it stands for, but it's an acronym for something. Pretty much they want to be able to beam a laser up to a UAV and have a series of UAVs kind of transmit the power to each other, reflect the power, and then beam it back down to some target somewhere for some effect, whether that's directed energy or power transfer or anything else. That's kind of their whole concept and what they're going for. However, there are other applications of this tech as well. Again, shill for Red Helm. This is the slide that we made at some point. You don't have to go back to the ground, right? If you're going from the ground, you can go to the air and power things. So persistent flight is kind of the holy grail of wireless power at the moment. If you can have high altitude persistent flight, there's a lot of things that both commercial and defense personnel are very interested in. If you can allow for a kind of high payload vehicle to fly for a long period of time, which right now is not particularly easy to do in most circumstances. And then I guess final one, if anyone cares, this is from Powerlight, but no one cares because they're stupid. So what's next? So honestly, it's probably going to be another 40 years of the same for space-based solar power. Spider will continue to get hundreds of millions of dollars because it's Northrop. And they'll probably eventually launch the satellite that's already made and tested and just sitting in a warehouse somewhere. Europe and JAXA will also keep pushing. I have some faith that JAXA will launch something, but it will probably be underwhelming. And eventually, there will be something out there. But it'll be a long time before we see anything around the Earth sending power to the ground. In the meantime, DARPA and Air Force and Space Force and a lot of those folks are becoming more interested in the concept of energy on demand from terrestrial sources. So kind of like that image I showed you from DARPA, being able to ping power around the battlefield as you'd need without having to send an F-15 with 15 gallons of kerosene into the battlefield. You can kind of just ping a laser over there and get power where you need it. And something I didn't talk about, but has been a pretty strong source of funding for a lot of companies. In fact, one that there was a picture of the logo, I didn't really talk about them, but Volta is lunar and cislunar power transfer. So don't ask me why, but NASA really cares about powering the moon with lasers and powering cislunar transit. That's another one where no one's given me a good explanation of why anyone cares, but NASA does. So kind of to wrap it up just real quick, and then I'll answer questions. It's a pie in the sky idea, but it will eventually happen because we will necessitate it as a civilization. It's just whether or not, the real question is whether or not it's the sun that we end up targeting. But yeah, any questions about that?
What is this lunar?
It's just transit to the moon, like in between the moon. Yeah, Luke.
I mean, you said the pie in the sky. You want to bring the pie down to Earth. Why don't we just use it to power satellites? It sounds very good. That other company that was pinging it around different satellites. That sounds very bad. Do that.
Yeah.
What is that concept?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think Pulse, which is the company you're referring to, and there's a few others, have a really strong commercial outlook because like a few other companies that are doing in-orbit satellite repair and docking and then such like that, for certain satellites, or a certain class of satellites, it is very, it's very productive to keep them in orbit longer, and they have a set lifespan. So if you can double their lifespan by sending them power, or in the case of what are they called? I think jellyfish space. Is that right? Starfish space. Starfish space. If you can dock and service a satellite in orbit and extend its lifespan a few years, then that can be worth tens of millions of dollars for certain satellites. That being the case, it doesn't solve the actual problem because, at least right now and for the foreseeable future, the majority of humanity's infrastructure is not in space. So sending power to other satellites is great, but unless you can get that back to Earth in some way, whether that's physical or via like wireless power, it's not going to solve the problems that space solar power was trying to solve.
It's a huge economic development, right? So how much does it actually cost to send a satellite up?
Right now, like if you wanted to send, like, okay, so Aetherflux, the example company I gave, they're sending effectively a small sat. It's a little bit larger than like a CubeSat or something like that, but it's like refrigerator size. I think a ticket on like Starship is like 500 grand for that.
How much better is it than a captive power solar cell?
Oh, okay. Solar density in space over there is like roughly 13 to 1400 watts per meter. So it's significantly higher than on Earth. But once you actually do the link budgeting, is like what the term is, from that 1400 watts per meter, what you can get on the ground, you end up, and this is part of the problem, you end up always higher, but not like significantly higher than, and just like putting a solar cell on the ground. It's higher, but there are trillions of dollars that would need to be spent. So it's not worth the 5% increase in efficiency. Yeah. Sure. Yes.
You said that like we're gonna like sort of as Earth as a civilization we will like eventually manifest this. So why will we like the efficiency gains like large enough? Like what's the point?
Well, I don't think we'll manifest space solar power around Earth. I think we'd manifest a Dyson swarm. That's my like concept, would be that we would skip over putting a bunch of satellites in space, and we would instead at some point be able to send large enough satellites in orbit around the sun and then solve the problem of getting the energy back to Earth.
So all the existing programs have the end conclusion of wanting to be a Dyson swarm?
No, they all have the end conclusion of wanting to be around the Earth. No one's even touching that right now because the closest spacecraft we've put around the sun was the Parker Solar Probe, and even that is at its closest approach only like a little bit closer than what we would want a Dyson swarm to be, and that thing was like a tank. It was like built to be like close for a short period of time. So if you have like a giant array facing the sun, right now we're just not even close to being able to do anything like that.
So even if we had this around the Earth, the efficiency gain would still be marginal, right? As it stands right now.
As it stands right now, yeah. At least to get down to Earth.
Do they have any environmental concerns about this, like poking holes in the ozone with lasers, or even working with these photovoltaic cells? Like I've worked with these things, and they're thermodynamically horrifically inefficient. They heat up like a motherfucker. Like if you had these things around the Earth, like what are their concerns about that?
Yeah, so actually a lot of the proposals for space solar power is that it will be a net benefit because of like great like carbon fuels, and you get away from that. And because of the use for most of the programs until recently of using RF, there wasn't as much concern with like ozone layer depletion or anything like that. I don't know how the ones that are using lasers to come back to the Earth are justifying that with like potential atmospheric effects. That's a question for them. A lot of them are too early on to probably even have like really thought about that, if I'm being honest. Like I said, almost no satellites are in orbit at the moment.
Specific voltage differences, I should say, and those can only be caused by specific photons. So as long as you avoid those photons, it should be okay.
Yeah, like lasers are pretty uniform in terms of power and stuff, but there's a probability, right? Like you don't need that many to, yeah. I can also answer any technical questions because I know I didn't actually talk about the tech that much, so I don't know.
Sorry, that's my phone cost. The kind of RF on Earth kind of that system.
Mm-hmm.
Their logos that they got.
Oh yeah, reach. Yeah, okay.
So those guys, how far?
Yeah, they're pretty far. So they recently did a sustained, I think they call it sustained hover instead of like persistent flight, but they had several of their ground stations and with their beamforming tech were able to coalesce power beams to a single UAV that was kind of flying, and they were able to demonstrate like net positive charge on that. And I guess to that question, the way that you like the receiving thing for RF is a rectenna. I don't know, but it's a receiving, a rectifying antenna. So you take like a rectifier, which exists in like a lot of circuitry, and you kind of plug that into an antenna, and all of a sudden you're able to take in RF transmissions and output a DC voltage. So that's how that would function. Yeah, there are like at-home ways you can do stuff like this if you have like if some sort of RF power source. Yeah. Yeah, it's not actually like a there's a reason it started in the 40s. Like it's not a crazy concept at its core, but the main issue is the fact that you go 1 meter and you have a beam. You go 10 meters and all of a sudden you have a giant cone that's 10 meters in radius, and all of a sudden it's very low power density. All right, thank you.